When I woke up on Christmas morning, my husband was gone, and the only message he left said, "Open it later." The house was still warm. The tree lights were on. Cinnamon hung in the air like nothing had changed. Snow fell outside the windows in that soft, careful way it only does on holidays, like it doesn't want to interrupt anything sacred. His coat was missing from the hook. No note. No argument from the night before. No slammed doors. Just silence where my husband Xavier should have been. I stood there for a long time, holding my phone, staring at that single message. It didn't feel angry. It didn't feel rushed. That scared me more than if it had. I tried calling him. Straight to voicemail. By noon, my phone buzzed again. An email this time. No subject line. Just photos. Xavier. Smiling. Leaning close to another woman. Her hand on his arm. His head tilted toward her in a way I knew too well. The photos were clear. Carefully framed. Taken to hurt. I didn't have to guess who sent them. Minutes later, another message arrived, this one from my mother-in-law Yolanda. "I thought you deserved to know who he really is." The words felt rehearsed. Polite. Almost kind. My hands shook as I scrolled. The humiliation came fast and heavy, like being pushed into cold water without warning. I imagined Christmas dinner already happening somewhere without me. Laughter. Pity. Judgment. By late afternoon, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was Xavier. Now, the message said. "Open it now." Attached was a folder. Recordings. Signed documents. Dates. Names. Conversations I was never meant to hear. And suddenly, the photos didn't look the same. I sat down hard on the floor, back against the couch, as the truth came into focus. He hadn't disappeared that morning. He had walked straight into the fire. And as the snow kept falling outside, I made myself one promise: whatever they were trying to erase, I would make sure it survived. Before we go on, tell me where you're listening from, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories coming soon. In early December, in Chicago, Illinois, our house still felt like something I had helped build, not something I was borrowing. I had stepped back from my consulting work the year before, telling myself it was temporary. My husband Xavier Robinson's family business was expanding fast, and every dinner conversation seemed to come back to timing, optics, and loyalty. Someone needed to keep our life steady while everything else moved. That someone became me. I handled the holidays. The schedules. The quiet smoothing over when tensions showed up uninvited. I told myself that was what partnership looked like. Xavier worked longer hours as Christmas approached. He always said it was just the season, end-of-year pressure, board expectations, last-minute negotiations. I believed him. I wanted to. When he came home late, tired but distracted, I learned not to ask too many questions. His mother Yolanda Robinson started calling more often around then. Not openly hostile. Just concerned. Asking how I was really doing. Reminding me how much responsibility rested on Xavier's shoulders. How much the family had sacrificed for the business. Sometimes she'd pause, like she was choosing her words carefully, and say things like, "This lifestyle isn't easy for everyone." I never argued. I didn't want friction. I thought patience would earn respect. At family gatherings, decisions were made without me in the room. When I entered, conversations shifted. Smiles tightened. I noticed how often my name wasn't used when plans were discussed. Xavier noticed too. I could tell. But he never challenged it directly. He squeezed my hand instead. Promised we were solid. That none of it mattered. I believed that, too. Because at the time, I thought distance was just distance, not preparation. By mid-December, the small signals I'd been ignoring started lining up too neatly to dismiss. The first thing that changed was the calendar. Dinners with friends quietly disappeared. Weekends I thought were ours filled up with family obligations I wasn't always invited to. Xavier never framed it as exclusion. He called it efficiency. Easier for everyone, he said. I smiled and adjusted. That had become my reflex. At the office holiday party for the family business, I stayed close to the edges of the room, holding a glass I never refilled. My sister-in-law Monique Robinson moved through the crowd like she belonged at the center of it, greeting clients, laughing easily, introducing herself as if the future were already decided. When someone asked what I did, she answered before I could. "Oh, Faith keeps everything running at home," she said, like it was a compliment. Xavier didn't correct her. He looked tired. Preoccupied. I told myself he hadn't heard. Later that night, as we drove home through snow-slicked streets, I mentioned it carefully. Not accusing. Just noticing. He sighed, one hand tight on the wheel. Said it wasn't worth making a scene. Said the family was under pressure and everyone was tense. I let it go. A few days later, a package arrived addressed only to Xavier. Thick envelope. Legal paper. I didn't open it. I never opened his mail. But when I handed it to him, his face changed in a way I couldn't read fast enough. He told me it was routine. Contracts. Nothing to worry about. That night, I lay awake listening to him breathe, staring at the ceiling, replaying moments that suddenly felt unfinished. Conversations cut short. Glances exchanged when I entered rooms. Decisions announced after they'd already been made. It wasn't hostility. That would have been easier. It was something quieter. Something that felt like I was being moved, slowly and carefully, out of the frame, before anyone said it out loud. A week before Christmas, Yolanda invited us to dinner. The message came through Xavier, not directly to me. That alone should have told me something, but I agreed anyway. I told myself families drift and correct all the time. That this was a correction. Their house was already full when we arrived. Coats piled by the door. Laughter carrying from the dining room. I stepped inside and felt that familiar pause, the half-second where conversations decide whether to continue. They didn't. His father Wallace Robinson nodded at me politely, already turning back to his drink. His brother Kellen Robinson barely looked up from his phone. Monique smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Dinner was loud, fast, and oddly structured. Business talk dominated the table. Expansion plans. Legal timelines. Words that floated over my plate without landing. When I tried to ask a question, it was answered vaguely or redirected. At one point, Yolanda leaned across the table and asked Xavier if he'd finalized the arrangements yet. He hesitated. Just a beat too long. Almost, he said. No one explained what that meant. After dessert, Yolanda pulled me aside in the kitchen. She spoke softly, like she was offering advice, not drawing lines. You know how close this family is, she said. We've always handled things internally. I nodded, unsure where she was going. She touched my arm. Xavier has responsibilities that require focus. The business needs stability. No distractions. The word sat between us, heavy and deliberate. On the drive home, I asked Xavier what she meant. He said she was just stressed. That I was reading too much into it. I wanted to believe that. But as I stared out at the Christmas lights strung across empty storefronts, I realized something had shifted. The warmth I once felt around his family was gone. In its place was something colder. Not rejection. Preparation. 2 days after that dinner, I noticed my name missing from things it used to be part of. It started small. A group text about Christmas plans that Xavier mentioned in passing but never appeared on my phone. A calendar invite he forwarded to me instead of including me on. Each omission felt accidental on its own. Together, they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. I asked him about it while we wrapped gifts in the living room. The tree lights reflected in the window, turning the snow outside into soft blurs of color. I tried to sound casual. Light. He frowned at his phone, scrolling. Said the messages must have been sent to an old list. Said it didn't mean anything. I let it go. Again. Later that night, I posted a photo from last year's holiday dinner. Nothing dramatic. Just a memory. Within an hour, the photo disappeared from the shared family album. No comment. No explanation. When I asked Monique about it, she replied quickly. Too quickly. Oh, we're just reorganizing things, she said. Trying to keep the album more professional. Professional. As if I had never belonged there as a person, only as an accessory. That word stayed with me. It followed me into conversations that suddenly went quiet when I walked into rooms. Into calls where Yolanda's voice softened but her questions sharpened. She asked whether I planned to go back to work. Whether I felt fulfilled. Whether I worried about becoming too dependent. They weren't insults. That was the clever part. They were concerns. Framed carefully. Polished enough to repeat later. That night, as I folded laundry beside Xavier, I watched him carefully. He seemed distracted, distant in a way that felt rehearsed. Like he was balancing two truths at once. I realized then that whatever was happening wasn't impulsive. It was organized. And I was being edited out slowly, with intention. The first accusation didn't come directly. It arrived disguised as concern. A few days before Christmas, Wallace called Xavier while we were having breakfast. I could hear only one side of the conversation, but I recognized the tone immediately. Calm. Measured. The kind people use when they're laying groundwork. After he hung up, Xavier sat quietly for a moment, staring into his coffee like it had given him bad news. What was that about? I asked. He hesitated, then said his father was worried. About stress. About balance. About whether I was putting too much pressure on him without meaning to. I laughed at first. Not because it was funny, but because it felt unreal. Pressure? I was the one keeping our life running while he disappeared into meetings and calls. I was the one absorbing his family's moods, translating their silences, smoothing over every sharp edge so he didn't have to. Xavier rubbed his face and said it wasn't an accusation. Just a question. He said families check in like that. That's when I felt it shift inside me, from confusion to something colder. Later that afternoon, Yolanda called me directly. Her voice was soft, almost sympathetic. I hope you don't feel overwhelmed, she said. Sometimes emotional dependence happens without anyone realizing it. I asked her what she meant. She smiled through the phone. I could hear it. We all want what's best for Xavier. By the time I hung up, my hands were shaking. It wasn't just that they were talking about me. It was how carefully they were doing it. Every word sounded reasonable. Repeatable. Safe to say in front of lawyers, boards, or witnesses. They weren't attacking me. They were building a version of me that could be removed without guilt. And for the first time, I understood something clearly. This wasn't about Christmas. It was about control. By the time Christmas week arrived, the house felt different, like it was already half-packed, even though nothing had moved. Xavier was home less. When he was there, his phone stayed face down on the table, screen dark but close. He answered messages in other rooms. Stepped outside to take calls he used to take in front of me. None of it was dramatic. That was the unsettling part. One evening, I asked him directly if something was wrong. He said no too quickly. Then he corrected himself and said things were just complicated right now. Family stuff. Business pressure. End-of-year stress. All temporary. I nodded, even though the word temporary no longer felt honest. That weekend, Yolanda hosted a pre-Christmas brunch. I didn't find out until Xavier mentioned it casually, like it was a minor detail. He said it was mostly business-related. That I wouldn't be bored sitting through it. I didn't argue. I told him to go. When he left, I stayed behind and wrapped gifts alone, the sound of tape tearing too loud in the quiet house. I caught myself rehearsing explanations for why I wasn't there, in case someone asked. That scared me. Later that night, Monique posted photos from the brunch. Smiling faces. Champagne glasses. A table I recognized. Xavier stood beside Yolanda, listening closely as she spoke. I wasn't in any of the pictures. Not even cropped out. It was like I had never been invited. When Xavier came home, I asked him why no one had told me. He looked genuinely torn for a moment. Then he said it had all been last minute. That it wasn't meant to exclude me. But exclusion doesn't always come with intention. Sometimes it comes with silence. As I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, I realized something else had changed. I had stopped feeling like a partner. I felt like a problem being managed, quietly, efficiently, and almost kindly. The next morning, a notification popped up on my phone that I almost ignored. It was from the bank. Nothing alarming. Just a routine alert about a document update tied to our joint account. I opened it without thinking, expecting a statement or notice. Instead, I saw a permissions log, recent changes, neatly listed, with timestamps. My access hadn't been removed. That would have been obvious. It had been limited. Small things. Viewing rights delayed. Approval steps added. Nothing I couldn't technically live with. But enough to slow me down. Enough to make me feel it. When I asked Xavier about it that evening, he looked surprised. Too surprised. He said it must be temporary. Said the family's corporate accounts were being audited, and the bank probably bundled things together by mistake. He promised to fix it after the holidays. I watched his face as he spoke. He wasn't lying exactly. He was repeating something he'd been told. A few hours later, Yolanda called again. She asked if I was feeling anxious lately. If the holidays were overwhelming. If I'd noticed how much pressure Xavier was under. She said it gently, like concern. Then she said something else, just as gently. Sometimes independence gets blurry in marriages, she said. Especially when one person steps back from their career. There it was. Not a threat. A narrative. By the time I hung up, I could see the shape of it forming, quiet conversations, careful language, documentation layered over time. They weren't pushing me out all at once. They were making a case. That night, I opened my laptop and started reviewing old emails. Holiday planning threads. Financial notes. Messages I'd once skimmed and forgotten. I wasn't sure what I was looking for yet. Only that whatever story they were telling about me, I didn't intend to let it be the only one left standing. 2 days later, I received an email that wasn't meant for me. It came from a corporate address I recognized, forwarded accidentally by someone who must have been moving too fast. The subject line was neutral. Forgettable. The kind you'd skim and archive. But my name was inside it. Not as a recipient. As a concern. The language was careful. Clinical. Phrases like risk exposure, emotional volatility, outside influence. No accusations. No emotion. Just assessments written in a tone that suggested they'd already been discussed elsewhere. I read it twice before my hands started shaking. They weren't asking whether I was a problem. They were deciding how to manage one. I didn't forward it to Xavier right away. I needed to understand what I was looking at. The email referenced meetings I hadn't known about. Advisors I hadn't met. Legal review timelines that extended well past the holidays. This wasn't sudden. It was layered. That evening, I asked Xavier if there were any formal discussions happening about our finances or personal boundaries. I kept my voice steady. Curious. Non-threatening. He paused. Just long enough. Then he said no. Said nothing official. Said his family sometimes talked in hypotheticals and it didn't mean anything concrete. I nodded, but something in his tone told me he was holding back, not to deceive me, but because he didn't know how much I already sensed. Later that night, Monique sent me a text. Casual. Friendly. Hope you're doing okay. Families can be intense this time of year. I stared at the message for a long time before replying. Because I finally understood the shape of the trap. They weren't trying to make me look bad. They were trying to make me look unstable, calmly, patiently, and with enough paperwork to make it stick. And once I saw that clearly, something inside me settled. Fear didn't disappear. But it stopped running the room. The realization didn't come with panic. It came with clarity. Once I understood what they were building, I started seeing it everywhere. In the way questions were phrased. In the pauses after I answered. In how concern was offered only when someone else was listening. I noticed how often Yolanda mentioned support systems. How Wallace framed conversations around safeguards. How Monique used words like optics and perception, even when we were talking about family. They weren't hiding it anymore. They were rehearsing it. A few days before Christmas, I ran into Preston Fairmont at a charity event Xavier had encouraged me to attend alone. He greeted me warmly, but there was hesitation underneath it. Like he was weighing every word. He asked how I was holding up. Said holidays could be hard when things felt uncertain. I asked him what he meant. He smiled politely and said nothing at all. That silence told me more than any accusation could have. When I got home, I found Xavier in his office, door half closed. He was on a call. I didn't mean to listen, but my name floated out before I could stop myself. She doesn't know, he said quietly. Not yet. I stepped back before he saw me. My heart didn't race. It slowed. That night, I sat at the kitchen table long after the house went quiet. I replayed every moment from the past month, aligning them like pieces of a map. The omissions. The paperwork. The language. The witnesses being gently primed. They weren't trying to confront me. They were trying to define me. And once defined, I could be removed without resistance. For the first time since this started, I stopped asking myself what I had done wrong. Instead, I asked a different question, what they were so afraid I might do if I understood the truth. Christmas Eve arrived wrapped in quiet politeness. Xavier was home, technically. His car in the driveway. His shoes by the door. But he moved through the house like a guest who didn't want to stay too long. Conversations stayed light. Surface level. He asked if I needed help with dinner, then disappeared before I could answer. That night, Yolanda called to confirm Christmas plans. She spoke like everything was settled. Dinner at her house. Extended family invited. A full table. She didn't ask if I was coming. She assumed. After the call, I asked Xavier directly if anything was happening that I didn't know about. I didn't soften it this time. I didn't smile. He looked at me for a long moment. Long enough that I thought he might finally tell me everything. Instead, he said tomorrow would be easier. Said things would make sense soon. Said he just needed me to trust him. I wanted to. God, I wanted to. But trust requires ground. And I was standing on air. Later, while he showered, I noticed his phone on the nightstand. The screen lit up briefly with a calendar reminder. No details. Just a title and a time. Open it later. I didn't touch the phone. I didn't need to. That phrase hit me like a warning bell echoing backward through time. It felt intentional. Final. Like something already set in motion. As midnight passed, I lay awake listening to the distant sound of snowplows on the street. I thought about everything I had given up to make this life work. Every compromise I'd framed as love. Every silence I'd mistaken for peace. By the time Christmas morning arrived, I wasn't confused anymore. I was braced. And whatever they thought they were about to do, they had underestimated one thing. I was paying attention. Xavier came back the morning after Christmas like nothing had happened. No apology. No dramatic explanation. He moved through the house quietly, set his keys on the counter, and asked if I'd eaten. The normalcy felt almost insulting after the silence he'd left behind. I waited. He didn't sit down right away. He checked the windows first. The door. Lowered his voice even though we were alone. "They're watching," he said. That was the moment the story finally cracked open. He told me he hadn't gone to see another woman. He'd gone to meet her knowing exactly how it would look. The photos weren't an accident. They were bait. The woman was a lawyer, Andrea Whitestoney, and the meeting had been staged weeks in advance. His family had been preparing for months. They'd been documenting me, framing conversations, rewriting history. The goal wasn't just to separate us. It was to erase me cleanly. Xavier slid his phone across the table. "Open it," he said. Inside were recordings, short clips at first. Yolanda's voice. Calm. Precise. Talking about containment and reputation management. Contracts attached to emails. Notes from advisors discussing timing and exposure. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I listened. Xavier admitted his part without flinching. He let them believe he was compliant. He attended meetings. He nodded. He signed nothing that mattered. Every delay had been intentional. They needed me to walk into it, he said. So they'd stop hiding. I asked him why he hadn't told me sooner. He didn't answer right away. Because once you knew, he said quietly, you'd be in danger of reacting. For the first time since Christmas morning, I felt something solid beneath my feet. Fear didn't vanish. It sharpened into focus. The next few days moved differently. Not louder. Not faster. Just sharper. Xavier didn't dump everything on me at once. He rationed the truth carefully, like he was afraid too much at once would knock the air out of me. Each night, after the house settled, he opened another folder. Another thread. Another piece of a story that had been written without my consent. I learned how long it had been going on. When my name first appeared in meeting notes. How early Yolanda had started framing me as a liability instead of family. There were gaps. Delays. Redactions that made no sense until they did. Advisors asking for behavioral assessments. Lawyers discussing voluntary separation scenarios. No one ever said divorce outright. They didn't need to. Xavier explained how the staged meeting worked. Andrea had been introduced as neutral counsel. Someone to walk him through options. The photos were insurance. Proof, if needed, that he was already pulling away. I asked him what would have happened if I'd broken down publicly. If I'd confronted Yolanda. If I'd panicked. He didn't soften the answer. They would have documented it, he said. And used it. That night, after he went to bed, I stayed up alone at the kitchen table. I replayed the recordings again, this time listening for tone instead of content. Where voices dropped. Where words were chosen too carefully. That's when something shifted. I stopped hearing myself as the target. I heard them as people who needed control to feel safe. The fear I'd been carrying didn't disappear. But it stopped flooding me. It condensed. Into patience. Into listening. Into the understanding that nothing I did next needed to be immediate. Or emotional. Or visible. Because for the first time, I wasn't behind the story anymore. I was reading ahead. The first thing I learned was not to move. That felt wrong at first. Every instinct told me to confront Yolanda, to demand explanations, to force the truth into the open. But Xavier was clear, any visible reaction would be logged, analyzed, and folded neatly into the story they were already telling. So I stayed quiet. Outwardly, nothing changed. I answered messages. I thanked people for gifts. I showed up when expected and kept my voice steady. If anyone was disappointed I hadn't exploded, they didn't show it. Behind the scenes, we slowed everything down. Xavier filed routine delays. Asked for clarifications. Requested revised drafts after the holidays. Each delay bought us time and pulled more people into the process. More witnesses. More email threads. Meanwhile, I started building my own record. I saved voicemails. Screenshotted texts. Downloaded shared calendars before they could be edited. I stopped deleting anything, no matter how small it seemed. Patterns don't appear all at once. They emerge when details repeat. One afternoon, Preston called under the pretense of checking in. He asked how I was doing. I answered honestly, but calmly. No anger. No fear. There was a pause on the line. Then relief. He asked careful follow-up questions. Questions that weren't casual. When we hung up, I realized something important. Silence wasn't just protecting me. It was unsettling them. They expected noise. Defensiveness. A reaction they could label. What they got instead was absence. Neutrality. A woman who didn't behave the way the file suggested she would. That night, Xavier told me Yolanda had asked if I'd been taking things well. I smiled when he said it. Because the trap they'd set depended on one assumption, that I wouldn't recognize it in time to step around it. Clifton Northwood, a consultant, came into the picture quietly. Xavier didn't introduce him as an investigator. Just a consultant. Someone to help us organize timelines. That phrasing mattered. It sounded harmless. Administrative. The kind of thing no one objects to. Clifton didn't ask dramatic questions. He asked precise ones. Dates. Times. Who was present? Which conversations happened by phone and which by email? He mapped everything onto a calendar so detailed it felt invasive at first. But patterns began to surface almost immediately. Meetings scheduled just after family gatherings. Calls made within minutes of my name being mentioned. Legal drafts circulating before any visible conflict existed. Nothing illegal. Not yet. Just coordinated. Clifton flagged the staged meeting with Andrea as a pivot point. Not because of the photos, but because of who had known about it beforehand. The list was longer than I expected. Advisors. Board members. People who later claimed ignorance. Memory gets flexible under pressure, Clifton said. Records don't. That line stayed with me. We hit our first real obstacle when we tried to access earlier versions of the contracts. Some had been archived. Others required formal requests. Waiting periods stretched into weeks. It was frustrating. Exactly what they counted on. Instead of pushing, we documented the resistance. Logged response times. Saved denial language. Delays have fingerprints if you look closely enough. Meanwhile, Yolanda grew warmer. She checked in more often. Asked how I was sleeping. Complimented my patience. That kindness felt strategic. She didn't know what Clifton was building. She didn't know that every friendly message, every careful word, was being timestamped and placed inside a larger picture. Not as proof of malice, but as evidence of control. And once control becomes visible, it becomes vulnerable. The first real crack appeared in a place no one was watching. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a document stamped confidential. It was a scheduling conflict, small, almost laughable on its own. 2 meetings listed under different titles, on different calendars, with the same people attending both. Clifton caught it immediately. One meeting was supposed to be about end-of-year projections. The other, according to internal notes, involved personal risk mitigation. Same room. Same time. Same attendees. Different stories. When we cross-referenced the dates, the conflict lined up perfectly with the week Yolanda had started calling me more often. The concern wasn't spontaneous. It was timed. We didn't confront anyone. We didn't ask questions that would raise alarms. Instead, Xavier casually forwarded one calendar invite to the wrong thread, just enough to prompt a polite correction. The correction came fast. Too fast. Language shifted. Titles were edited. The meeting was retroactively reframed as informal discussion. No one acknowledged the overlap. That scramble told us everything. It meant there were versions of the story they didn't want sitting side by side. Around the same time, Raven Kingswell, a compliance officer, reached out to Xavier with what sounded like a routine compliance check. She asked for clarification on internal approvals tied to family accounts. Her tone was neutral, but the questions were specific. Later, she emailed again. This time, she copied more people. Processes don't panic. People do. Yolanda's calls slowed. Wallace stopped reaching out entirely. Monique became distant online, her posts suddenly careful, sanitized. No one accused us of anything. They didn't need to. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. For the first time, their attention wasn't on managing me. It was on protecting themselves. And that told me something important. The story they'd written about me was starting to interfere with the one they'd written about each other. The fear didn't leave all at once. It loosened. That's how I noticed the difference. I woke up one morning and realized my chest wasn't tight anymore. The constant hum of anticipation, the waiting for the next accusation, the next quiet maneuver, had softened into something manageable. Not safety. Control. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head. Stopped imagining worst-case outcomes. When messages came in, I read them once instead of 10 times. I no longer felt the need to explain myself in advance. That shift mattered more than any document we'd uncovered so far. Clifton called it a pivot point. Not legally. Psychologically. When they're acting, he said, they need you reactive. Once you're steady, the script weakens. I tested that theory. At a family lunch I hadn't been excluded from, carefully neutral, almost polite, I spoke less. Listened more. When Yolanda made a pointed comment about resilience, I nodded and thanked her. No defensiveness. No correction. Her smile flickered. Later, Xavier told me she'd asked privately if I seemed detached. Detached wasn't the word. I was awake. Behind the scenes, we made one quiet move of our own. Xavier shifted a minor authority, nothing dramatic, nothing public. Just a small internal change that rerouted approvals through a neutral process instead of family oversight. No one protested. They noticed later. That delay mattered. Because by the time questions surfaced, the change had already been logged, reviewed, and normalized. Reversing it would have required explanation. Scrutiny. Paperwork. They let it stand. That night, I sat alone in the living room, tree lights still glowing even though Christmas had passed. I thought about how power actually works, not through force, but through timing. They'd been counting on my fear to rush me. What they got instead was patience sharpened into strategy. The waiting started to work on them. It showed up in small ways at first. Follow-up emails sent too quickly. Questions asked twice. People checking whether they'd already said something. Control slips when it has to monitor itself. Raven reached out again, this time asking for documentation that should have existed months earlier. Her message was polite, but the subtext was clear, something wasn't lining up. When Xavier asked where the records were, the answers varied depending on who replied. One person said legal had them. Another said they were never finalized. A third claimed they'd been withdrawn for revision. All reasonable explanations. None of them matched. Clifton mapped the responses side by side. Same question. 3 answers. No coordination. That's what pressure does, he said. It reveals where stories were memorized instead of lived. We didn't correct anyone. We let the inconsistencies stand. At the same time, Yolanda began reaching out again, but this time, her warmth felt rushed. She asked how I was feeling. Whether I needed anything. Whether I'd thought more about what the future might look like. She didn't wait for answers. She filled the silence herself. One evening, I overheard Xavier on the phone with Wallace. The tone was low. Tense. Words like timing and exposure slipped through before the call ended abruptly. They were no longer discussing me. They were discussing risk. That realization landed cleanly. Everything they'd done so far assumed I was the unstable variable, the unpredictable element they needed to manage. Now, uncertainty had shifted. Not because we confronted them, but because we stopped fitting the shape they'd assigned us. As I closed my laptop that night, I understood something with surprising calm. They were still moving. Still plotting. Still convinced they were ahead. But the advantage they'd relied on had already changed hands. The escalation came wrapped in formality. A courier delivered a thick envelope to the house one afternoon, addressed to Xavier but clearly meant for me to see. Inside were letters drafted in careful legal language, recommendations, not demands. Concerns, not accusations. They proposed boundaries. Independent evaluations. Financial restructuring. A temporary separation of interests for everyone's protection. The timing was deliberate. Late enough to feel reactive. Early enough to look prudent. Yolanda called an hour later. She spoke slowly, choosing each word like it might be read back one day. She said the family was worried about exposure. About how things might look if misunderstandings escalated. She framed the letters as a kindness. A way to keep matters private. I thanked her. That pause on the line stretched just a second too long. What she didn't know was that the letters had already created a problem for her. They referenced internal reviews that hadn't been formally authorized. Cited advisory opinions that hadn't gone through compliance. Used language that assumed conclusions before procedures were complete. In trying to look careful, they'd skipped steps. Raven noticed immediately. Her follow-up email wasn't accusatory. It was procedural. She asked for the authorization trail supporting the recommendations. Requested dates. Approvals. Documentation. None of which existed in the way the letters implied. By the end of the week, what had been positioned as a protective measure was being reviewed as a process failure. Not dramatic. Not public. But real. Yolanda stopped calling. Wallace didn't return messages. Xavier received a brief note acknowledging receipt of the documents and flagging them for internal review. No blame assigned. No conclusions drawn. Just scrutiny introduced where control used to live unchecked. That night, I sat quietly with the copies spread across the table, feeling something settle into place. They had finally made a move big enough to be seen. And in doing so, they had stepped into their own light. The review didn't announce itself. It didn't come with meetings or warnings or raised voices. It arrived as a shift in tone, emails that took longer to return, questions routed through neutral channels instead of family threads, decisions deferred pending clarification. Raven became careful in a way that felt deliberate. She stopped assuming context. Asked for written confirmation. Copied people who hadn't been included before. Nothing about it was hostile. That was the problem. Clifton explained it simply. Once a process is flagged, control changes hands. Slowly. Quietly. But permanently. The family felt it too. Yolanda reached out once, a short message asking if everything was okay. No commentary. No advice. When I replied politely, she didn't respond. Monique canceled a public appearance she'd been promoting for weeks. The announcement cited scheduling conflicts. Privately, she went silent. Wallace missed a standing call with Xavier and didn't reschedule. Small withdrawals. Each one isolating. Behind the scenes, the review expanded. One question led to another. A missing approval pointed to a rushed decision. A rushed decision required explanation. Explanation required witnesses. Preston was asked to clarify his recollection of a meeting he'd once described vaguely. This time, the question was written. Time-stamped. He asked Xavier what was happening. Xavier told him the truth, just enough of it. After that, Preston stopped hedging. His responses grew precise. Careful. Honest. That honesty shifted the weight of the inquiry. Not toward blame, but toward accountability. The family didn't lash out. They tightened. That told me everything. People who are certain of their power don't go quiet. They assert it. Silence, I learned, is what control sounds like when it's being slowly dismantled. And as the review moved forward, methodical, unemotional, unyielding, I understood something with absolute clarity. The collapse wouldn't be loud. It would be inevitable. Time stretched in unfamiliar ways after that. Days passed without updates, then suddenly 3 emails arrived in one afternoon, each asking for a different clarification. None of them accused anyone of wrongdoing. They didn't have to. The questions alone carried weight. Raven asked for documentation tied to authority transfers that had happened quietly over the past year. Not major ones. Minor adjustments. The kind people make assuming no one will ever look back. Clifton smiled when he read the list. These don't disappear, he said. They echo. Xavier responded carefully. He provided exactly what was requested. No commentary. No defense. Every response clean, factual, restrained. Watching him work through it, I saw how much discipline it took not to explain himself. Meanwhile, the family started to fracture in small, visible ways. Monique reposted an old article about leadership ethics, then deleted it within the hour. Kellen stopped attending meetings he used to dominate. Wallace sent a single message to Xavier asking if everything was still aligned. Xavier didn't answer right away. That delay was intentional. When he finally replied, his message was neutral. Professional. Almost distant. He acknowledged the question without committing to anything beyond process. That was when I felt the shift most clearly. Power wasn't being seized. It was being redirected. Decisions that once moved through family channels now moved through systems. Reviews replaced assumptions. Paper replaced influence. One evening, as we sat together quietly, Xavier told me Yolanda had asked if I'd been involved in any of this. He said he hadn't answered. I didn't feel offended. I felt calm. Because the question itself meant she no longer knew where the edges were. That night, as I closed my laptop, I realized something important. They were still looking for a moment to confront. What they were facing instead was a process that no longer needed permission to continue. The first consequence arrived without a name attached to it. An agenda item quietly disappeared from a scheduled meeting. No explanation. No announcement. Just gone. It was one of Yolanda's initiatives, something she'd championed for months and spoken about as if it were inevitable. When Xavier noticed, he didn't ask why. He forwarded the updated agenda to Clifton instead. Clifton compared versions. The removal wasn't random. It followed a review note. A single line requesting additional substantiation that had never been provided. Without that support, the item didn't survive the process. That was how things started falling apart, not through confrontation, but through absence. Raven sent another request that week, this one broader. She asked for a summary of informal decision-making channels used over the past 2 years. The phrasing was neutral. The implication was not. Informal meant undocumented. Undocumented meant exposed. Yolanda didn't call me anymore. When she did reach out to Xavier, her messages were shorter. Less assured. She asked questions instead of giving direction. Wallace attempted to smooth things over. He suggested a private conversation. A chance to reset. Xavier declined politely and asked that any discussion go through appropriate channels. That answer closed a door they hadn't realized was already locked. Preston confirmed, quietly, that others were growing nervous. Not about guilt, but about proximity. People who once benefited from silence were now afraid of it. That fear didn't spread evenly. It moved upward. By the end of the week, I could feel it settle into the spaces Yolanda used to occupy so confidently. Meetings she once dominated now paused without her input. She was still present. But she was no longer steering. And as I watched the structure she'd built begin to rely on rules instead of her will, one truth became impossible to ignore: control doesn't disappear all at once. It erodes, piece by piece, until even the person who held it can't find where it went. The pressure finally reached Wallace. It didn't come as an accusation. It came as a request for clarification, one that couldn't be ignored without consequence. Raven asked him to confirm his role in approving a series of decisions that had been framed as collective, but never formally recorded. He hesitated. That hesitation showed up in the timestamp. His response came hours later than expected, carefully worded, almost cautious. He claimed the approvals were informal, based on trust, on long-standing family practice. That explanation might have worked once. It didn't work anymore. Clifton pointed out the problem immediately. Informal authority only holds when no one questions it. Once questioned, it requires proof. Wallace had none. Xavier forwarded the exchange without commentary. By the next morning, Wallace requested a private call. Not with Xavier alone, with legal counsel present. That choice spoke louder than any admission. People who feel secure don't need witnesses. The call didn't resolve anything. It couldn't. Wallace spoke in circles, deflecting responsibility upward, downward, anywhere but himself. He didn't deny decisions were made. He denied remembering how. That vagueness became its own problem. After the call, Raven sent a follow-up outlining next steps. Expanded scope. Additional documentation. A timeline review that would reach back further than anyone expected. Wallace didn't respond. Instead, Yolanda reached out to Xavier later that night. Her message was brief. Almost restrained. "We need to talk. This has gone far enough." Xavier didn't reply immediately. He waited. When he finally did, his response was calm, professional, and devastatingly simple. All communication should go through the review process. I read the message twice before handing the phone back to him. Because in that moment, I understood something clearly. This wasn't about punishing them. It was about removing the shortcut they'd relied on for decades. And without that shortcut, they had no idea how to move forward. Preston broke quietly. Not publicly. Not all at once. He asked for a meeting under the excuse of alignment, wanted to make sure everyone was on the same page before things went further. The phrasing was careful, but the request itself was new. He hadn't asked for permission before. During the call, he spoke slowly, choosing accuracy over loyalty. He clarified timelines. Corrected assumptions he'd previously let stand. Not because he was confessing, but because the old version of events no longer protected him. At one point, he paused and said, "I want the record to reflect what I actually recall." That sentence mattered. Clifton muted the line and smiled faintly. "That's the turn," he said. Once memory becomes individualized, coordination collapses. After the call, Raven followed up with written questions based directly on Preston's clarifications. The scope narrowed, but the depth increased. Fewer people. Sharper focus. Yolanda's name appeared more often now, not as an authority, but as a reference point. Decisions attributed to her influence instead of collective agreement. That shift was subtle, but irreversible. Later that day, Monique reached out to me for the first time in weeks. Her message was friendly, almost nostalgic. She mentioned family. Holidays. How stressful things had become. I replied politely. Briefly. She didn't push. That restraint told me more than any accusation could have. People who feel cornered look for exits. People who feel exposed look for allies. I wasn't either. As evening settled in, I realized the weight in the room had changed. The tension no longer felt directed at me. It hovered somewhere else now. Around unanswered questions. Around timelines that wouldn't align. Around a truth no one could fully control anymore. For the first time since this began, I felt something unexpected, not triumph. Relief. The attempt to erase me didn't stop. It just stopped being subtle. My name vanished from a draft document that circulated late one evening, an internal summary meant to outline affected parties in the ongoing review. Xavier was listed. The family entities were listed. Advisors were listed. I wasn't. Not excluded by mistake. Excluded by design. Clifton caught it immediately. He compared versions, highlighting where my name had appeared before and where it had been removed. No explanation accompanied the change. No note. Just a quiet deletion, like I'd never been relevant to begin with. That move was riskier than they realized. Because once a person is erased from paperwork mid-process, the question isn't why, it's who decided they could do that. Raven flagged it the next morning. Her message was brief. Professional. She asked why an individual previously identified as materially impacted was no longer referenced. She requested justification and authorization. None came. Hours passed. Then a vague reply arrived, citing streamlining and clarity. No signatures. No approvals. That answer didn't satisfy process. It escalated it. By afternoon, the review widened again, not outward, but downward. Earlier drafts. Earlier assumptions. Earlier decisions that had been taken for granted. Yolanda didn't call. Instead, Wallace sent a message asking if I was comfortable with how things were being handled. The word landed wrong. Too late. Too rehearsed. I didn't respond. Because comfort was never the point. Visibility was. That night, as I sat beside Xavier, reading the latest updates, I felt something settle with quiet certainty. They had tried to make me disappear. What they had actually done was leave fingerprints where none had existed before. And fingerprints don't fade once the light is turned on. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that came before it. No calls. No check-ins. No friendly concern wrapped in soft language. Days passed with nothing but procedural emails moving back and forth, stripped of tone and personality. The family's presence had retreated behind legal phrasing and third-party channels. Influence replaced by distance. That told me more than confrontation ever could. Yolanda had always believed in proximity, being close enough to steer outcomes without appearing to touch them. Now she was nowhere near the wheel. And she knew it. Xavier received a notice late one evening. Not disciplinary. Not punitive. Just an update. Certain decision-making authorities were being temporarily reassigned pending completion of review. Temporary was the word people use when they hope something comes back. Clifton didn't. Temporary structures become permanent all the time, he said. Especially when no one fights for them. No one did. Kellen missed another meeting. Monique's public presence thinned until it felt deliberate. Wallace stopped sending messages altogether. They weren't regrouping. They were waiting for someone else to move first. That someone wasn't us. We stayed steady. Responded when asked. Provided what was required. Nothing more. Nothing emotional. The absence of reaction became its own answer. One afternoon, Preston sent a brief note thanking Xavier for his professionalism. No context. No explanation. That was enough. Because gratitude only appears when someone realizes the ground beneath them has shifted, and they're grateful not to be blamed for it. That night, as I looked around the house that once felt borrowed, I understood something clearly. They hadn't lost yet. But they had stopped winning. And once momentum changes, it never needs permission to keep going. The moment they realized it was over didn't come with drama. It came with distance. A revised organizational chart circulated internally late one Friday afternoon. No announcement. No commentary. Just an update posted where updates always lived. Xavier's name had shifted slightly. Not higher. Not louder. Closer to the center. Yolanda's wasn't gone. But it wasn't anchored anymore. Clifton noticed it first. He compared the new version to the one from 6 months earlier. The change was subtle enough to miss unless you knew where to look, but once seen, it couldn't be unseen. Authority no longer flowed through family proximity. It flowed through process. Raven sent a final note before the weekend. The review would continue, she said, but certain interim structures would remain in place to preserve operational stability. Preserve. Not restore. That language mattered. Yolanda didn't reach out. Wallace didn't ask for a call. Monique posted a carefully worded message about transition and reflection, then disabled comments. No one fought the chart. No one challenged the changes. Because doing so would have required explaining how things had worked before. And no one wanted that explanation on record. That evening, Xavier and I sat together in silence, the house finally quiet in a way that didn't feel hollow. He asked if I was okay. I thought about the months of erasure. The careful cruelty. The way control had been dressed up as concern. I am, I said. And meant it. Because this wasn't victory. It was something colder. Something slower. The kind of ending that doesn't announce itself, but keeps unfolding long after the room has emptied. And as we moved into that quiet space between acts, I understood one final truth. They had built a system to remove me. What replaced it was a system that no longer needed them. Spring arrived without asking permission. The snow disappeared first, then the tension followed, slowly, unevenly, like something thawing that had been frozen too long. There was no announcement marking the change. Just time doing what it always does when given room. The review never closed. It didn't need to. Instead, updates came spaced weeks apart, each one smaller than the last. Adjustments made permanent. Interim decisions quietly adopted as standard practice. No reversals. No restoration of what had existed before. Xavier's role settled into its new shape. He stopped being consulted as a bridge between family factions and became a point of stability others routed through directly. It wasn't power in the way Yolanda understood it. It was authority earned by consistency. Yolanda reappeared once, indirectly. A message sent through a third party, asking whether we'd be attending an upcoming event. No pressure. No entitlement. Just an inquiry that felt unfamiliar on her tongue. We declined. No explanation offered. That answer traveled farther than we expected. Invitations slowed. Calls thinned. The family's presence in our lives faded into something ceremonial, polite, distant, careful. I noticed the difference most in myself. I stopped scanning rooms when I entered them. Stopped wondering how things would be interpreted. The need to manage perception had loosened its grip. One afternoon, Preston mentioned, almost casually, that certain initiatives Yolanda once championed had been sunset. Not cancelled. Retired quietly, without acknowledgement. The word lingered. Sunset. Not failure. Not defeat. An ending that arrives naturally, once the light shifts. As I stood by the window that evening, watching new leaves take hold where snow had been, I felt something settle that I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction. Release. Because the collapse we'd set in motion wasn't loud. It was lasting. And it was still unfolding, exactly as it was meant to. The first public sign came from someone we hadn't expected. A business journal ran a short piece on governance transitions within family-led companies. It wasn't about us directly. No names. No accusations. Just an analysis of how informal authority can quietly dissolve when processes mature. Preston sent it to Xavier with a single line, worth a read. The timing wasn't accidental. Within weeks, partners began adjusting their tone. Requests once routed through Yolanda's circle came instead through neutral offices. Meetings grew shorter. Agendas tightened. Decisions required documentation where intuition used to suffice. Yolanda attended fewer events. When she did appear, she stayed close to familiar faces and left early. Her presence no longer redirected rooms. Monique's public image shifted too. Less polish. More distance. She leaned into safe topics, philanthropy, wellness, reflection. Anything that didn't invite questions. The consequences weren't dramatic. They were cumulative. Xavier told me one evening that a long-standing partnership had quietly renegotiated terms. Reduced exposure. Fewer joint appearances. No confrontation. Just a recalibration that spoke volumes. I realized then how reputations actually change, not through scandal, but through hesitation. People pause. Then pull back. Then move on. The family still had resources. Still had access. What they no longer had was inevitability. No one assumed their involvement anymore. No one deferred automatically. That loss didn't show up in headlines. It showed up in body language. In email phrasing. In how quickly rooms emptied when certain conversations ended. As I watched it unfold, I felt a strange calm. This wasn't revenge in the way stories promise. It was consequence, arriving on its own schedule, without needing us to announce it. The legal consequences followed the same pattern, quiet, procedural, unavoidable. No lawsuits were filed. No charges announced. Instead, letters arrived. Notices. Required disclosures tied to past decisions that had once slipped through without question. Each one asked for the same thing, clarification. Clarification takes time. Time costs money. Xavier showed me a summary one evening, stripped of names and drama. Advisory fees increasing. Compliance costs expanding. Reviews that required outside counsel instead of trusted insiders. None of it looked like punishment. All of it looked expensive. Wallace surfaced briefly during this phase. He sent a message asking if we could talk as a family. The tone was gentler than before, almost nostalgic. Xavier replied with a single sentence, copied to counsel. Please direct all inquiries through the appropriate channels. That door closed without a sound. Yolanda's response came weeks later, through a different intermediary. A proposal to revisit certain assumptions. No apology. No admission. Just an attempt to renegotiate reality. We declined. Silence followed. What replaced it was paperwork, unforgiving, methodical, indifferent to history. The kind that doesn't care who someone used to be, only what can be supported now. I noticed how often the family's name appeared in footnotes instead of headlines. Referenced, not featured. Required, not sought. That demotion mattered. Because influence isn't lost when someone is blamed. It's lost when they become inconvenient. As summer settled in, the process continued without urgency or mercy. Each step small. Each one irreversible. And in that slow grind, I understood something clearly. They hadn't been defeated. They had been reduced to scale, to relevance, to a size the system could finally manage without them. Yolanda tried once to reassert herself. Not directly. Not publicly. She hosted a private gathering at her home, nothing formal, just a dinner with familiar faces. The kind she used to orchestrate effortlessly. The kind that once set agendas without appearing to. Only half the invites were accepted. The rest declined politely. Conflicts. Prior commitments. Silence. Those who did attend stayed briefly. Conversations were cautious. No one lingered. No decisions followed. When Xavier heard about it, he didn't comment. He didn't need to. The attempt had failed on its own. A week later, a long-standing committee was restructured. Yolanda's role shifted from advisory to honorary. The title sounded generous. It wasn't. Honorary meant visible without authority. Present without influence. She didn't protest. Protesting would have required explaining why the role mattered. Monique adjusted again. She leaned into appearances that didn't overlap with the business. Lifestyle features. Panels. Spaces where questions stayed superficial. Kellen withdrew almost completely. He stopped positioning himself as an heir and started exploring opportunities elsewhere. Distance as survival. One evening, Xavier mentioned that a vendor had requested to remove a legacy clause tied to family discretion. The clause had once been non-negotiable. Now, it was optional. That's when it hit me. Power hadn't just shifted. It had become conditional. No one owed them deference anymore. Influence had to be earned again and again and again. As I stood in the kitchen that night, listening to the quiet hum of summer outside, I felt the finality of it settle. This wasn't a fall from grace. It was something colder. A slow recalibration that left them exactly where their reach ended, and no further. Kellen was the first to say it out loud. Not in a meeting. Not in writing. He said it in a quiet moment, to someone who repeated it later without realizing how much weight it carried. There's no path forward here anymore. That sentence traveled faster than any rumor. Because it wasn't emotional. It wasn't accusatory. It was practical. The family had always assumed continuity. That power would pass smoothly, predictably, down the same lines it always had. Kellen had been positioned as the future without ever having to fight for it. Now the future had requirements. He missed deadlines. Arrived late. Spoke cautiously when he used to command. The confidence he'd inherited didn't survive scrutiny. Within months, his role narrowed. Responsibilities redistributed for efficiency. Mentorships reassigned. The language was neutral. The effect was not. Kellen didn't protest. He couldn't. Doing so would have meant demonstrating value in a system that now demanded proof instead of pedigree. Monique adjusted again, this time more visibly. She distanced herself from internal discussions altogether, leaning into a public persona that required no authority. Influence without accountability. Wallace faded completely. His name remained on documents, but his presence did not. He stopped attending anything that required decisions. Yolanda watched it all from the edges. No speeches. No pleas. Just observation. The dynasty she built didn't collapse in flames. It thinned. Opportunities moved elsewhere. Younger voices were invited in. Processes replaced loyalty. As I watched the structure shrink into something smaller and quieter, I felt an unexpected mix of emotions. Not triumph. Not pity. Understanding. Because what they lost wasn't taken from them. It was revealed as something they no longer knew how to hold. Monique reached out to me late one evening, months after the last real contact we'd had. Her message was warm, almost familiar. She asked how I was. Mentioned how strange everything felt now that the dust had settled. Said she missed when things were simpler. I read it twice before responding. Simplicity, I'd learned, is often just control that hasn't been questioned yet. I replied politely. Briefly. I didn't ask questions. I didn't reopen doors. Whatever she was looking for, it wasn't something I could give her anymore. She didn't push. That told me she wasn't reaching for reconciliation. She was reaching for alignment. For a way back into a narrative where things still made sense. Around the same time, I noticed I'd stopped being referenced altogether in family conversations. Not erased this time, just irrelevant. The distinction mattered. Erasure is violent. Irrelevance is final. Xavier confirmed what I already felt. Decisions no longer circled around his family's reactions. They moved forward without anticipation or caution. The emotional gravity had shifted elsewhere. One afternoon, Preston mentioned that newer leadership groups were forming organically. Not as a rejection of the past, but as an acknowledgement that it no longer fit. Yolanda wasn't included. She wasn't excluded either. She simply wasn't required. That was the truest consequence of all. As summer edged toward fall, I realized I no longer checked for updates. I didn't need to. The outcome was no longer uncertain. They had lost the ability to define the future. And in that loss, they'd also lost the power to define me. I closed my laptop that night feeling lighter than I had in years. Not because I'd won, but because I was finally free from the need to watch them lose. The physical distance came next. Not as an escape. As a choice. Xavier and I didn't announce anything. We didn't frame it as a reset or a new beginning. We simply stopped orbiting the same center. Work opportunities shifted. Commitments changed. What once required proximity no longer did. We moved quietly. Not far enough to make a statement. Far enough to breathe. The new place felt neutral in a way our old home never had. No inherited expectations. No layered history. Just space that belonged to the present instead of the past. I noticed how differently Xavier carried himself there. Lighter. More direct. Less guarded. He wasn't managing reactions anymore. He was making decisions. One evening, as we unpacked the last of the boxes, he told me something I hadn't known. Yolanda had asked him, weeks earlier, if this distance was temporary. He hadn't answered right away. When he finally did, he said he wasn't sure distance was the right word anymore. That answer ended the conversation. Not angrily. Not cruelly. Just honestly. I felt the shift fully then, not as loss, but as alignment. The life we were building didn't require negotiation with people who had already shown us how they measured worth. Our days settled into a rhythm that didn't include vigilance. No scanning. No anticipation. No mental rehearsals. Peace arrived in pieces. In mornings without tension. In evenings without strategy. In conversations that didn't need to be translated later. As I stood in the doorway of our new home that night, listening to sounds I hadn't learned to associate with conflict yet, I understood something clearly. The most complete power transfer hadn't happened in boardrooms or documents. It had happened here. In the quiet decision to live somewhere our story could no longer be edited by anyone else. The request for reconciliation came the way everything else had by then, indirectly. Not from Yolanda. Not from Wallace. It came through a mutual contact, phrased carefully as concern. A suggestion that time had passed and perhaps it was healthy to reconnect, to clear the air before things became permanent. The word lingered. Permanent. Xavier showed me the message without comment. He didn't ask what I wanted to do. He already knew. We talked it through anyway. Not emotionally. Practically. What would reopening contact actually change? What would it repair? And more importantly, what would it cost? The answer was simple. Too much. We declined politely. No explanations. No conditions. No counteroffers. Just a boundary stated clearly and left untouched. The response was silence. Not angry silence. Not wounded silence. The kind that happens when someone realizes leverage is gone and nothing more can be negotiated. Later, Xavier told me Yolanda had reacted with disbelief rather than grief. She hadn't asked why. She'd asked how long. That question said everything. I felt no urge to correct her. No need to explain that this wasn't a pause or a tactic. It wasn't punishment. It was a conclusion. That evening, as we sat together without distraction, I thought about how hard I'd once worked to earn approval that was never freely given. How carefully I'd managed emotions that were never mine to regulate. Letting go of that responsibility felt unfamiliar. And then it felt light. Because reconciliation, I realized, only matters when it's offered after accountability. What we were being offered wasn't peace. It was access. And access was the one thing we no longer owed anyone. The final consequence didn't arrive with paperwork or meetings. It arrived with absence. A season passed without contact. Then another. No messages routed through intermediaries. No soft attempts at connection. The system they had relied on, proximity, pressure, obligation, had nothing left to operate on. Xavier mentioned once, almost in passing, that a long-held position had been filled by someone new. Younger. external, qualified in ways that didn't rely on history. The appointment wasn't controversial. That was the point. The family name still carried recognition, but not direction. It opened doors politely, not automatically. Influence had become conditional, earned moment by moment like everyone else's. Yolanda didn't disappear. She adjusted. Her presence shifted into ceremonial spaces, events where appearances mattered more than outcomes. Photos were taken. Smiles exchanged. But decisions happened elsewhere, long before she arrived. I saw one of those photos online by accident. She looked composed, dignified, untouched. I felt nothing. No anger. No satisfaction. Just distance. That neutrality told me everything I needed to know about how complete the separation had become. One evening, Xavier asked if I ever wondered whether they understood what had happened. I thought about it carefully before answering. It doesn't matter, I said. Understanding was never the goal. What mattered was that the structure which had once tried to erase me no longer had the power to define anything at all. As night settled in, I realized this was the quiet ending the story had been moving toward all along. Not vindication. Not apology. Just a life unfolding without interference. And in that steady, unremarkable peace, I found something deeper than victory. I found permanence, the kind they could never negotiate their way back into. The following Christmas arrived without ceremony. No tension in the air. No rehearsed expectations. No quiet dread hiding beneath tradition. Just a simple morning, light filtering through the windows, the world moving at its own pace. I made coffee and stood by the window, watching the street wake up. No snow this time. Just cold air and clear ground. It felt fitting. Xavier joined me without a word. We didn't exchange gifts right away. We didn't need to. The meaning had shifted. What mattered wasn't what was wrapped or exchanged, it was what wasn't missing. No fear. No silence shaped like threat. No waiting for someone else to decide how the day would go. The phone stayed quiet. Not because anyone was holding back, but because there was nothing left to say. Later, as we sat together in the calm of the afternoon, I thought about the woman I'd been the year before. How carefully she'd tried to earn space in rooms that were never built for her. How long she'd mistaken endurance for love. I didn't judge her. She had survived long enough to learn. What the family lost wasn't taken from them. It dissolved under scrutiny. What I gained wasn't power over anyone else. It was authorship. I chose what stayed. I chose what ended. I chose what mattered. That choice didn't come with applause or witnesses. It didn't need them. Because the most complete justice isn't loud. It's quiet continuity, a life that keeps moving forward, untouched by the hands that once tried to shape it. As the day settled into evening, I felt the story close gently behind me. Not like a door slammed shut. Like one finally locked from the inside. If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it. If you have a unique story of your own, share it in the comments below. Thank you for listening.